now it's going to be handing over to my good friend Andy Davies, who is going to tell us everything we want to know and maybe didn't want to know about WebPageTest. There isn't many people, I think, that knows more about it than he does, having sort of written half of the book that was recently done on it by O'Reilly. So again, I'm sure you can follow up with that. So without more ado, I'll hand over to Andy, and he'll talk through till about 8 o'clock. And then we'll have a new pizza supplier at 8:15, hopefully not half an hour early tonight. Otherwise, they'll get sacked off like Domino's did last time. Anyway, so I'll hand over to Andy and hope you enjoy the talk.
Cool, thank you, Perry. Well, I didn't actually write half the book. Rick Viscomi wrote half the book. I wrote about a quarter of the book as my royalty show. And look, so originally I was going to talk in July, but this bloke Jake cried off, and so I ended up doing it. And if I log in, this is right. Okay, so who hasn't heard of WebPageTest? I'm really sorry to ask the question that way, but has anybody never heard of it? There's maybe one person. I won't embarrass you, even if your colleague will, friend will. So WebPageTest has been around a long time. It was originally created by Pat Meenan, who now works as part of the Chrome team. When he was at AOL, it was called PageTest. It was a Windows application. I actually started using it when it was a Windows application. And I make this claim, and Pat's never disputed it, that it's probably the best thing to have ever come out of AOL. It's got a big public infrastructure. It's global. You can also run your own private infrastructure. Tonight, I was mainly planning about talking about things such as scripting, some of the more advanced features of the UI, the API, some of the things to do with running your own private instances, which is sort of beyond the normal, here's a waterfall, let's examine the waterfall. But is there anybody who'd like me to start with the basic waterfall and just look at that as a first instance? A nod, a shake, yes, no? Yes, cool. Right, okay, so we'll get there. So as Perry said, I'm partly here to pimp my book. It has a beautiful colored spotted jenna is the animal. And if you ever write a book for O'Reilly, you never get to pick your own animal. Some author does that for you. And the book came around a couple of years ago. Rick, who didn't work for YouTube at that time, Marcel, who still worked for Twitter, and Sergey Chernishev, who founded probably the original web performance meetup in New York, and I were at Velocity Conference or sitting on a roof in San Francisco, having lunch at Twitter, and we had this crazy idea, let's write a book. 2.5 years later, we eventually got around to finishing it after much hassle from our authors, from our editors. So we built the book, and the book covers everything from the basic use cases of WebPageTest through to using it in CI. Marcel wrote a CI wrapper that's quite handy. I wrote the section on running your own private instance and some of the challenges with that. And I was also supposed to write a chapter on monitoring it, and I didn't make that. So that'll be in the second edition. So the book's there. Go buy it. We won't be millionaires, I can assure you of that, but your custom will be appreciated. So I think one of the best places to start is probably talk about how WebPageTest works. Because it's one of the areas I find that people don't often have a good grasp at. And WebPageTest is a series of very, very clever hacks. Over on this side, we have a server that's pure PHP code. Nothing particularly clever about it. You can run it on Ubuntu or Windows. And when you use webpagetest.org or your own private instance, that's what you're interfacing to. That's where you type your URL in, type in your number of tests, pick where you want your page to be tested, and off it goes. Where the real hacky code is in the test agents over here. And if we take the Windows test agents, for example, all the test agents poll the server for jobs. And in the desktop world, they are, I don't know of anybody who's not running a Windows agent in the desktop world, but if we take, there's an executable program that runs, polls the server for jobs, and then decides which browser it's going to fire up. In the case of IE, it fires up IE and then injects a DLL into the process that monitors what IE is doing so it can pick up the information. In the case of Firefox, it both does some DLL injection and sniffing of WinINet's layer and has a Firefox extension. In the case of Chrome, it uses the Chrome debugging API to instrument Chrome to see what's going on. And as we'll come to a bit later on, they have implications. So the test agents load the web page, record the metrics about it, fire the results back to the server. Sometimes they'll record a film strip if you want it, and fire that back. The mobile is a bit more involved. And what happens in the mobile world is there's a NodeAgent. And this NodeAgent is currently the bane of my life, for which I'll come on to. And what happens is the NodeAgent polls the server looking for work and then controls either an iOS device or an Android device via the Chrome debugging protocol, because iOS, Safari, remote debugging is the same underneath. It's just wrapped up in a binary protocol. They talk to a Wi-Fi access point. The NodeAgent also configures a free BSD bridge that uses DummyNet that controls how much bandwidth that device gets. The bane of my life at the moment is because when you get the DevTools JSON back and the other results you want to send back to the server and it goes to compress them up, I've got a 4 gig Mac Mini on my desk where I'm currently trying to get iOS into a state where we can put it into production. It runs out of memory whenever you test an Angular app on it. The zip utility you use, and I'm going to switch to using a native zip on it, for a 10 meg file consumes 4 gig of RAM. So there are challenges. So, this is what we typically get as a result on WebPageTest. And yes, nice screen where you can't see any of the lines. We get the summary metrics at the top. We get a waterfall. We get a film strip of the page loading. And if I actually go in and pull one up so we can have a look, my Wi-Fi works. Yeah, and this is the BBC gentleman from the Telegraph at the moment. You're okay. So when I first look at a waterfall, the first things I do is I tend to look at the speed index, which is how quickly the page reached visual completeness. And then I tend to look at what's going on in the waterfall themselves. And the 3 charts I really look at is I look at the slope of the waterfall as it comes down and see, is it like this or is it like this? Because if it's like this, it means it's evolving over time. The other thing I generally look at is what's going on in terms of CPU utilization and bandwidth. What we're seeing at the moment from a lot of sites we look at, particularly in WebPageTest, is they're slow to load in the beginning because the CPU is pegged, because we've got a lot of JavaScript in that initial page load, and processor is actually the bottleneck. And then, we don't often see things that are bandwidth constrained these days. So that's where I start. And that's the basics of what a waterfall looks like. But, the other thing we can do is get a repeat view so we can check how well our main page is cached or the page we loaded. Are we using caching effectively? But these are the sort of common run-of-the-mill things. And if you notice on this one, how's that for a horrible DNS lookup for all your third parties? But we look at first view and we look at repeat view, but we're beginning to look at things beyond that and beginning to do stuff with WebPageTest that allows us to get a far deeper look into how our sites perform. And the secret to this is when you load WebPageTest for the first time, and this advanced settings tab is closed. And has everybody here opened that advanced settings tab? Because you'd be surprised how many people don't, and how many people don't discover actually that they can do more than just pick a browser or pick a location. And it opens the whole new world where we can begin to do things like choose the type of network setting we want, whether we want cable, whether we want 2G, whether we want 3G, whether we want to build our own custom one. The other common thing which we see people do with WebPageTest is they only choose to do one run. I always do 3, 5, I do 9. If I'm really worried about performance, I'll do 49. You can't do it on the public. But sometimes where we're looking for differences in performance between things, the amount of variation we're getting doing more runs allows us to pick a more stable medium. And the other one is I, out of habit, keep all my tests private, and I always capture video. Private tests aren't private. If somebody else knows the URL, they can pick it up and go look at it. They're just a bit harder to discover. Back in about 2008, perhaps, there was a web performance optimization competition that was run in conjunction with a French retailer. And I can't remember who organized it. But WebPageTest was going to, the idea was, over a month period, you got to compete to see how much you could speed up this French retailer's site. And it was a genuine French retailer who was up for it. And WebPageTest was to be used as the metric, or as the measure as to who got it the best. And what some of us discovered quite early on is the fact that private tests weren't private. So you could go in and look and see what other optimizations people were doing and feed them into your own competition entry. So it's far more private now. But when we get onto the other advanced tab is where we begin to find more interesting things. So one of the things I often do is do a TCP dump, capture what happened with TCP on the wire. Because sometimes poor performance isn't at our page level. It's not about how we've designed our page. It's about packet loss. It's about bad networks. I used this when I was doing some work for a company that distributed music around the world about 3 or 4 years ago now. And to look at their download in Japan, I used the Japanese testers just to download an MP3 file. And what we could see is their NetScaler was really badly configured, and we were seeing packet loss and other issues. It's a complete abuse of WebPageTest, but it worked a treat. There are other things we can do, such as sometimes we see long AJAX requests that that the browser finishes capture the information before the AJAX request is finished. So we can increase the timeout to capture those. And the other one we do sometimes is inject headers, like Akamai's headers, so we can see which Akamai node we're being routed to, whether ION's in use, and things like that. But the other panel, and it's not surprising that they're Chrome only options, really, given Pat works for Google on Chrome, is the Chrome only options. And here we get to do some interesting things. So, for example, you can capture a DevTools timeline remotely. Download it, load it into Chrome, DevTools, and see what your timeline looked remotely. You can do things like capture the Chrome netlog or Chrome net internals. And one of the interesting things about capturing Chrome net internals is then you can begin to see how the WebPageTest executable on the agent actually communicates with the browser extension. And they're hooked together. They use HTTP over port 8888. So you can begin to see the protocol they use to communicate with each other, which is easier than trying to fit a loopback adapter onto a Windows box. The other area we use is you can feed custom command lines into Chrome. So if you use use -speedy equals off or no, I can't quite remember, and you've got a H2 site or a speedy site, it'll just do a plain HTTPS waterfall for you. So you can then do one, pick a speedy site or pick a H2 site, record it with speedy on and off, compare the results, see whether speedy is actually, or H2 is actually making a difference from you. And what we begin to see here is there are different types of parameters or different ways we specify how we want the test run to WebPageTest. There are browser command lines set. There are commands set for during the test itself, which page we're going to go to, what our viewport should be. And then we have some lower level things to do with which browser we're using or whether we're going to capture TCP information. But if we come in here, this is where I did Twitter, and I recorded it emulating Nexus 5 in this instance. But if you see down the side, you can see, we've got the TCP dump information. Not only have we got the TCP dump information, we've actually got the TLS keys. So when we download the dump and open it up in Wireshark, we can set the TLS keys that we use so we can decode the HTTPS session. So we can see what's going on and look in more detail. There used to be a link to CloudShark. And CloudShark is this lovely online version of Wireshark. Unfortunately, unless you've got an account with them and pay for it, you can only upload a 1 meg file anymore, which in terms of a TCP capture is really, really small. So those are the sort of things we could do with this. But the classic thing people show as an example with WebPageTest is what happens when a third party breaks. What happens when we have a SPOF or single point of failure, something in our critical path that fails. And, oh yes, I did pick the Telegraph, sorry. And what you can do in WebPageTest is choose a host that won't respond. And in this case, I did Optimizely, which is an A/B testing framework. I chose Optimizely last week when I did a similar talk in Amsterdam for a Dutch conversion conference, and we'll come on to that. But so you get the site to check, you pick the host, you want a black hole, and you eventually end up with a waterfall that looks like this, that, as we all know, a synchronous blocking JavaScript will reveal, I can't see my cursor, will reveal a very bad waterfall. But this should be nothing new to us. We know that if we use a blocking resource and that blocking resource is unavailable, we then have to wait for the Windows to time out the TCP connection. And that's the risk whenever we use a blocking resource. But other than doing that to embarrass various people, there are other things I like to do with WebPageTest, and because single points of failure happen all the time. The demos we all do are all around, there's this massive failure on this site, it takes 30 seconds, and third parties go, but that won't happen, we use a CDN. But what we actually see is we see micro failures all the time. A few years ago, practically every designer who used Typekit, I couldn't use their site at home because Typekit had an outage just with my ISP affecting 25,000 of us. So we have micro outages all the time. But one of the things I like to do is, and we're doing much more of at the moment, is helping people understand what's the trade-off they're making with third parties. Because we put third parties on our site because they bring value, because they're retargeting customers, or they allow us to test, or they're advertising. And so they, in theory, bring us a value, but they also come with a price. And that price is the impact they have on performance. So one of my favorite tricks is to actually run a test of a site and then go into the domains view and grab all the domains out. And sometimes I do it with a text editor. More recently, I've got a bit smarter about it. And if we pick this one, and what you'll find in WebPageTest is, although it's got web pages, some of the pages actually have JSON URLs behind them. And I know this one has a JSON URL behind it because I actually wrote this one for Instart Logic. I'd been to hospital in the morning, had a minor operation, been sedated, came home, sat on the sofa, wasn't quite sure what to do, so I wrote some WebPageTest code. And Pat accepted it after a few minor changes. But what it means is we can actually get that same HTML information in JSON. And then if I skip, let me just go back to the slides. Instead of editing it in a, copying it out and editing it in text editor, what you can also do is curl it, feed it through JQ, which is a way of transforming JSON. On a Mac, copy it to the clipboard. If I pick the right window, not that one, this one. So it was that test. We've downloaded it. If I go back to WebPageTest. Yeah, I know. Never do a live demo. That's good, Dulles. I'll talk about this in a bit. If we go block, and you just, and you paste them all in. The thing to do, remember when you do this, is take the domains for the website you're testing out. So if I ran this now, I'll get nothing back. But what you need to do is remember to take Telegraph out, for example, because that's the page you want to test. If you're testing something like Debenhams, remember to take their image CDN out, for example. But it's just a quick way we can run this test. Away it'll go. It'll finish sometime later. And what we'll get to see is we can create a film strip that shows us the difference of the site with those third parties in and those third parties out. And to do that, go to test history, pick your two tests you want to compare, and you get a film strip. And unfortunately, in this example, you'll notice the original is quicker. And the one with the third parties removed is slower, which doesn't really make sense until we begin to look at the waterfall. And when we look at the waterfall, we notice the waterfall looks very, very strange. And it just sort of goes out and out and out. There's no parallel downloads. And this comes back to what I said at the beginning about how the different browsers are instrumented. And if I was to test this in Firefox, which I'll show you in a minute, or IE, the blocking is done at the network level. In Chrome, it's done in the Chrome DevTools API. And blocking a URL or blocking a host name in the Chrome DevTools URI is really expensive. So we end up with this. What we've got is an artifact of the test environment instead of an example from something going wrong, what the test should look like. Now, if I skip on to the next one, you'll actually see that if we switch to Firefox, we actually get the result we expect. I'm sorry, this is the old Telegraph, not the new. The new Telegraph is much better, actually. A little better. No, it's much better. I tried it again today. So in this one where the third parties are blocked, it loads much faster than the old one. And what that then allows you to do is experiment and understand which third parties are costing you the most in user experience and trade them off against the value they deliver. The other thing that I do from time to time, but I don't use as often as I might, is you can also do custom metrics in WebPageTest. So I quite often use this for testing whether navigation timing is working as I expect in browsers. But you write a piece of JavaScript. Here we would count the number of iframes in the document, and then page loads, JavaScript runs after page load, and we get a count. Anybody use speed curve? That's fine. So if you go look in speed curve, if you go look at the raw web page test results, you can actually see all the custom metrics they're using to count up some of the information they've got. But one of the things that Simon and I spend a lot of time doing these days is going beyond simple single page tests. Because although that single page test matters, getting somebody to our site and keeping them there, we want them to go on to the next page. And we want to know, once they've landed, what's the performance of that next page. And this is where scripting comes into its own. And WebPageTest has a slightly different scripting language, to say the least. So let's imagine we want to search Google. And we want to search Google for London web performance, and we want to see what the waterfall for just the results page looks like. So we end up writing a script, something like this. So log data says don't capture any data for this step. Then we navigate to google.co.uk. We set the value of a form field to London web performance. Then we turn the data logging back on, and then we submit the form. And what we get is a waterfall of just that second page, of just the results page. And we can see that, this is where we get everything back as embedded as one page, and then Google loads some extra pieces afterwards. If we don't use that log data 0 and 1, we end up with a waterfall that looks slightly odd, like that one instead. Perhaps I should do that, and then you can be able to see it. So you end up with them superimposed on each other. So by turning the logging off for the first step, we can just look at the performance of the second step. To work out what the form field values are, I use DevTools. Just pull up Chrome DevTools, inspect the element. In this case, we can see the ID is ls-ib, as it was generated by Closure or something else, one of the Google's tools, and that's the way I do that. But we're getting to other interesting issues in that on the BBC site here, if I'm going to the BBC homepage and they want to click on news, there are no obvious anchors on this link. It's an unordered list with a list item that's then got an anchor tag inside it. So how do we go and target that? And where we can target that is not only does WebPageTest have the set value based on ID, it can actually, or we can target the link using document query selector, because WebPageTest can also execute JavaScript as part of its script, sorry. So we can go find the query selector, write what looks roughly the same script. Apart from here, I've used exec and wait, because what exec and wait does is it says execute this JavaScript, wait for it to finish processing. Whereas if we did, it wouldn't make any difference in this situation because we're not doing anything after it. Whereas just exec will execute this JavaScript and then go and execute the next step. And what we get is waterfall. What I've done here, as you'll notice, is if I go back here, you'll notice this selector says orb nav news A, whereas the selector I actually used has orbnavnews.com. And this is because this test was run in Dublin, and the BBC actually served different content outside the UK. So sometimes you run into these situations where people are doing geo-targeting and your scripts don't work because the page you're seeing outside the UK is different to the page you're seeing in your local browser and testing. And I've got some tips for how to solve that in a minute. But the other challenge is more complex things like the train line. And to do the train line has this type of head search. And we'll go and look at the train line because you begin to understand some of the challenges. So the train line, if I want to go from, say, Cheltenham, so I get a drop-down list. I then actually have to go and pick something off that list. And then I think I managed to do it before, but you have to actually type keys to get the drop-down to appear before you can click on it. And the nice way of doing this, and the train line really help, is in this case, to get when I did it originally, I filled in the form. I did get element by ID and filled in the origin station of Cheltenham, and then I did the submit. And it didn't work because the form didn't get filled because there's no key press on the dropdown. So what you can do is for pages that include JavaScript or include jQuery, you can use jQuery's key down method to make it think you've pressed on the dropdown. So, but jQuery must be already on the page. And then you end up, this is the full script that fills in Cheltenham, fills in Leeds in this case. I was going there, does the key down, says I want to go one way, turns data logging on, and then submits page. But this script fails due to timing issues, because that's the other challenge you get. You end up with a form that looks like this. It says, please enter a valid station, or And please enter the stage you're going to, because even though they've been filled in and you think you've clicked on the check on the drop down, you haven't. The browser's executed the click on the drop down before the JavaScript in the browser has managed to draw it. So that's when we feed in things like more exec and waits on the key down. So we'll wait for press the key down, wait for the JavaScript to run that shows the menu. The menu appears. We click on the station in the drop down, and eventually we get to the result, the train line. Scripting, the other one we can do is authentication. You can either do fill in a login box. You can set an authentication header by base64 encoding the username and the password. You can generate an OAuth code and send it as the header. So those are ways of doing authentication. I use set cookies sometimes. For the life of me, I've been trying to work out how to set cookies on sites like the BBC so I can get rid of their cookie banner. And I've never had enough patience to persevere to get rid of it, but I'll get there one day and write it out. But there's lots more about scripting in the docs. Debugging is a pain in the ass, for want of a better word. Use dev tools to check your DOM queries. I almost always use exec and wait coupled with a DOM query to target elements in the page. I hardly ever use things like set value or use WebPageTest's own script and do it. The way I found the BBC problem is that the selector name had changed is you can save the contents. You can save the responses you get from the web server in WebPageTest. And I saved those and searched through them until I found the element had a different name. If you've got your own private instance, you can watch tests run on your test agents, RDP into them, or if they've got to monitor them, and watch the test go and see where it fails. Adding sleep statements, or as we saw with the train line, switching to exec and wait can help as well. About a year ago, during a hackathon in work, I actually wrote a Chrome plugin to check WebPageTest scripts. I've never released it. Unfortunately, it's broken at the moment. So perhaps one day I'll get around to releasing that, and debugging scripts might be harder. The other thing WebPageTest comes with is an API. And it's a really, really simple API. But it's great for integrating WebPageTest into your processes. So first thing to do is request an API key. And thanks to the good people at Akamai, you can have API keys that'll do 200 tests a day. It's enough to get going, enough to get a feel for what you're doing. It'll work with a limited number of public locations. So it works with all the Dallas ones, which are all the locations in Pat's basement. And then it works with every EC2 location, apart from there's no Frankfurt on here, I noticed, and doesn't appear Akamai sponsor a Frankfurt node for WebPageTest, Michael. So can you sort that out? So it works with these locations. And it's really, really simple. You know, you submit, do a post, get even, sorry, to run test.php. And here we've set, we don't want video, we're going to use Chrome in Dulles. We want format response in JSON. We want first view only. This is our key. We want the test kept private, and we want to test BBC News. And I didn't set up a BBC News one before, but here's an example in Postman to test it, and it might actually be that one. And what you get back is a JSON result, because I chose JSON format. And what you can see in here is you can see this is my test ID and my owner key, and I've got a set of burner keys, so don't think that one's going to last. But what you can choose to get back is you can choose to have the results from the API in JSON, or you can choose XML, or the user URL will give you the web page. And if we actually go get, oh, HTML does that. So what we'll see back, because hopefully it hasn't run yet. It has run. What you get back normally is a URL as a JSON response that tells you the test hasn't completed. And you can poll that URL until you get the results back. And in this case, you get a massive JSON object with information on the first view, median view, every run you did, every request that was in there, the timings for all the requests, some calculated values like the effective BPS that you can then use for other things. And this is where I've skipped completely ahead of my slides. So Postman is handy for testing the API. And this is what the response would have looked like if I'd have put it in before the test had run, where you can, no, sorry, that's the test. That's the response from the original request. And then what we do is poll it. And here we can see it's got a status code of 100. Test has started. It tells you when it started. Keep polling it until we get a 200 and the test is finished. And you can poll the JSON or the XML, completely up to you. And then the test completes, and we get data galore as it's shown. But this is good. We can build APIs around it. Simon's built a bunch of tools around it. A lot of people use Marcel Duran's Node.js API wrapper. Jonathan decided to write his own because Marcel's doesn't use promises. But Marcel's will sit there and do a lot. It encapsulates a lot of dirty work for you and makes the WebPageTest API much easier to handle. But you know, sometimes you just want a quick and easy solution to test some sites. And we all love spreadsheets, right? So a couple of Christmases ago, I wrote a Google Docs spreadsheet that drives WebPageTest. And what Google Docs have underneath is they have a scripting capability that's very much looks like JavaScript. They call it AppScript. I haven't found any differences apart from their API. And so you can go get this. A version 0.5 is about to come out because somebody in the States found some bugs with the way I've done some things that need fixing. So what you can do is build a spreadsheet. And if I run, spreadsheet looks like this. So we've got a test tab that lists the URLs we want to test, the scenarios we want to test them against, which they'll come on to, and some results columns. Our scenarios are just basically a named, please load. Don't you just love demos over the web? Our scenarios, oh yeah, are just a named set of just a bunch of parameters grouped together by name. So, you know, I've named them Dublin, Chrome, Cable, mainly because they're located in Dublin. First one's using Chrome and using the cable network shaping. I've said I want 3 runs, I want video, and I want the first view. And on our last tab, we have the server URL, our API key, and some parameters we can use to set up what we have as results rows or what we want to pass as parameters. And then basically, we just go run tests and authorize it from one of my email accounts. And it'll submit the tests. We get a link to the test itself and the current status. And eventually, we'll just run. Here's the one I prepared earlier in true Peter fashion. You know, we can get the values for the parameters we pulled out. And this is good for testing a large number of sites with a small number of parameters, or a small number of sites with a large number of scenarios. A few years ago, I did 30 retail sites with 400 different scenarios. And ran 30,000 tests, basically, to prove or to revalidate Mike Belshie's paper, more bandwidth doesn't matter much, which looked at if you go above 5 megs per second in terms of network speed, you don't see a great improvement in page download speed. And it was a pain in the ass for that. But for things like I'm doing at the moment, where I'm helping a magazine look at the performance of the top 2,000 retailers across Europe, where we've tested 2,000 URLs from Frankfurt in a small number of scenarios, it works really well. And other people use it all the time. Tim Cadlick uses it, set performance budgets. It's there. Play with it, break it, send me pull requests, send me feature requests, and I will get around to doing something with them. So we've looked at things we can do with WebPageTest. We've looked at how to use the API. We've looked at, or we've talked about how you can use the API to build it into your continuous integration. And I've shown you a spreadsheet that you can use to put even more tests in. And sooner or later, if you start using WebPageTest heavily, you'll get bored waiting for your tests to complete. You will outgrow the public WebPageTest instance. And I did some testing yesterday, today. And what you'll find is if I was waiting ages for my tests to run, because I was using the API, so they had a low priority, sat in a low priority queue. So every location has a number of priority queues, of which high priority queue is when you submit via the web interface. Most API keys are P7 or 8. I can never remember which. Somebody's running a heap of low priority jobs there. But what you find is if somebody's doing a bunch of testing and they've stopped now. Well, we got there, somebody in Sao Paulo, there are 59 API jobs going. There are a bunch on the London instance as well. So if you submit a whole bunch of tests using the API to the London instance right now, you're going to wait a while for those to finish. So one of the things we can do is run our own WebPageTest instance or use one of the commercial services, whether you use SpeedCurve, whether you use GTmetrix, which I believe is WebPageTest underneath. We have our own product performance analyzer that we use the WebPageTest test agents, but we have our own UI over the top where we keep 30 agents running at a time. So when we do jobs for people, we can pull them through quickly. And running your own WebPageTest instance isn't actually that hard to get started. You can install Ubuntu and configure the PHP relatively easy. Windows agents are relatively easy to configure. They can be hard to get stable. One of the things we found is our Firefox agent kept crashing in production, or we had these 20-second gaps. And what we put it down to, or what we found out in the end, it was the Flash plugin crashing in Chrome, crashing in Firefox, sorry, and suspending all network traffic for 20 seconds. And it took us 3 weeks to debug that because it didn't happen consistently. And the fastest way to get started with your own WebPageTest instance is to use the pre-configured AMIs. There's one in every region. They will, see, there's even one in Frankfurt there. There's one in every region, and when you launch it, you'll get headless version of WebPageTest. So you'll have to go in settings and change the headless setting. So you've got a UI on it. But even in the headless version, you can sit there and fire API requests at it. And it will have pre-configured links to agents in all the AWS regions as well. So you fire up test this, you fire up a test against Frankfurt, it will go launch a AMI in Frankfurt, run your tests against it, and after a certain amount of time, shut down the AMI to save on your AWS bills. This is my WebPageTest instance, or one of them. This sits at home. This is a Mac Mini with running ESXi, It's an i7, 16 gig of RAM. It's got Ubuntu on it. It's got a couple of Windows 7 agents that are built off the modern IEVMs. I haven't checked recently, but until about a month ago, my home broadband connection was 4.7 megs, so less than the cable setting in WebPageTest. And I got more reliable, consistent results off that box than the Manchester public agent does. So that's the other thing to be aware of when you're using public web page test, is some of the test agents are more consistent than others. I would trust the AWS ones. I would implicitly trust the ones in Pat's basement. The Manchester one and the London one can be a bit flaky from time to time. The Frankfurt ones appear to be pretty stable, but test it and check. If you're doing tests and you don't like the look of the result, find another test location that's close to it and test the same page on it there. So this is my instance. It's not quite the same scale as Pat's basement. And these are the mobile phones that are on the public webpage test. These are a bunch of private Google ones, I believe. And then there's a whole bunch of other hardware in it. So, we're not going to compete with that. But what you can do is you can leverage this in your own webpage test instances too. So webpage test also has a relay mode. And what it allows you to do is piggyback other locations into your webpage test server. So places I do this. So if I skip out of this and I just go, so I actually run one for development purposes on my local Mac. So this is a relay agent, and you can see it hooks up Dublin and it hooks up to the ThinkPads in Dulles. And I use the ThinkPads in Dulles because they normally have very small queues because nobody knows about them. But what that means is I can start off tests on here. They go fired off into the public web page test infrastructure. They come back and I get the results locally stored on this machine. So you can do things like if you're using AWS ephemeral instances and you want to shut them down when you finished your big test, you can host your own server, set up your AWS to be a relay, go run the tests on AWS, pull the results back in, kill the AWS instances when you're done, and you've still got all the data.
Where are the relay settings? Is that locations?
Yes, it is locations.ini. There are samples in locations.ini. The only problem you'll find with this is to use the public agents in the relay mode, you need an API key. So they will run at the same priority as other API jobs in the public agents. But if you want to hook into somebody else's location, it's a good way of doing it. It's also nice to keep, if you want to keep the final results within your firewall, you don't want to host the agents yourself, but you want to keep the final results yourself rather than leaving them out there on some public infrastructure. That's what else it's good for. The only place there are mobile agents publicly available to people at the moment is in Pat's basement. When I finished having my electrics and plastering doing, I intend to host some agents, some mobile agents in the UK. But what I thought I'd do, because probably nobody else has, or not many, has anybody ever set up a mobile agent on WebPageTest? Tried. Did you try or did you fail? He tried.
You know it failed.
Well, yeah. So Perry and I have history where I set up a private WebPageTest instance for him many years ago. And we actually ran it using MobiTest, which is the old Akamai test agent, running on iOS simulators on Mac Minis. And we had to have a job that killed the iOS simulator every hour before the test ran because we'd never be sure it would finish. Fortunately, the iOS agents are a bit more stable now. They're not quite as stable as the Android ones, but what I thought I would do, because I'm game for a laugh, and last time I did this, I crashed and burned. So hopefully we'll do better now. What I thought I'd do is I'd actually film a mobile test, just so you can see what happens during a test, because unless you run your own agent, you'd never know. And so I need QuickTime. So if we come back to here, you'll notice that one of the things I can't do is talk and type at the same time. So yes, we have a local agent, and look, we have an iOS 9 agent. And we will pick on the BBC, and we will do, you'll see a picture of me first, don't you? Oh, look, yes, look. My Microsoft webcam works. We have a phone somewhere. It's that way, isn't it? And if I go here, you can read Perry's notes, just so I didn't write anything rude, isn't it? So go here. And hopefully, just check the other window. Oh, look at that. See? Fires up the iOS device. What you'll see is it'll come up blank, and then it'll come up with an orange screen. And you can see how long it takes. So there's the orange screen, and then it will load the BBC. And then it'll do it all again, because I probably had it on repeat view. And the reason it comes up with the orange screens is that's what, yeah, what's happened is, so the reason it comes up with the orange screen is that WebPageTest uses the orange screen to synchronize the video to the DevTools trace. So you can put them back together. Unless you use the very latest code off GitHub, what you'll find is your film strips have those orange frames in them. And it took me a while to debug that. But the reason it's killed the webcam is because when we're doing a test, the NodeAgent is firing up Safari on the device. It's then listening over DevTools for the traffic. It's also using the QuickTime remote record to capture the screen off the device. And then once it's done a run, it shuts down QuickTime and then starts again. So that's why we lost it. But what we actually get is a waterfall from Safari. And hopefully we'll get a film strip as well. Yes, see, I did better than last time. And look, pizza's here. And summary, so having shown that demo, what I'd like to say in sort of summary is that WebPageTest is a really great tool. You can use it for quick and simple testing. But if you spend time with it, if you learn its API, if you learn some of the other features it's got, like scripting, as much as a pain in scripting is, you can begin to get more value out of it. You can begin to understand beyond the single page load what your second page loads are. If you've got an image gallery on your site, you can understand the performance of going from one image to the other. There is hope that the WebPageTest scripting will get simpler. AppDynamics also use WebPageTest for their synthetic monitoring agents. And what they've done is built a fork of the test agent that actually uses Selenium as the scripting language. So it may get simpler. But if you take time to experiment, to learn, it'll pay you back in dividends. Thank you.
This mic, Andrew. Right, having dispatched Andrew to go and get the pizzas that are 15 minutes early, so a slight smack on the wrist for Papa John's. Right, great talk, very useful. Note to self, relay mode. I've definitely got to find out about that, how I can get use out of other people's servers. That sounds rather good.
I'll write a blog post up about it.
There you go. That'll be good. So anyway, do we have any questions for Andy? Oh,
Sod off you.
Right. We're not
anybody other than Simon.
Anybody other than Simon. Yeah, that's the thing.
And the Telegraph.
Hey, so at the Telegraph at the moment, I've just started to look at the third-party script requests, and we've got 4 or 5 different analytics tools, 4 or 5 tag managers, tag manager inside a tag manager inside a tag manager, and advertising. So how do I sell to stakeholders to say, look, you're having a detrimental effect on the website, because ultimately advertising makes money. The analytics tools all have different features, they all make money. How do I sell that to them to say, look, behave?
So the biggest thing you can do in the beginning is create one of those films. And it begins to help them understand what impact those third parties are having on that user experience. Because there's a trade-off, isn't it? It's a trade-off of you want to deliver a great experience, so people subscribe or they keep coming back to the Telegraph, but you need the revenue from those adverts. You need the data that's sent to retargeting people. And using the video is a good place to start the conversation. What you've got to do then is work out what's the optimal order to load those third parties. Are all those third parties being still used for starters? Because we come across people who aren't using third parties. But it begins to start a conversation about how can you simplify this? Do you need all those tag managers? Why are all those tag managers there? Because if you strip down to just one tag manager that loads those third parties effectively, what improvement does that make to your end user experience? And that's the way we do it with other clients.
Slatin, first, I'll come back to you, John.
Have you had to deal with kind of some sort of a malicious use of WebPageTest? Someone kind of trying to use it?
So there are so all the requests are tracked. The people who overconsume, so API, if you're on the API, there's a limit to how much you can use it because you run out of API credits on a daily basis. Some people, to get around that, write a robot that submits stuff via the front end, and there are various tools in place to pick up those and automatically block them. There's stuff in WebPageTest in the results, it flags up whether you're testing an adult site, for example. But you do come across issues from time to time running a public instance, and it happens to our own test agents where you test somebody's site who has a virus on it or some malicious, they've had malware injected onto it, and it ends up on your test agents, and we rebuild our test agents every night. We kill them off to keep them clean. So if you run a test agent and you're not testing your own site, you have automated setup so you can just kill it off and rebuild it, because you do end up testing websites and malicious stuff on them.
So you mentioned that Tim Cadillac uses it for performance budgets. Can you explain a bit more about that?
You need to watch Tim's talk about performance budgets, and what he uses so if you watch his talk about Radio Free Europe, which is I think the talk he talks about it in, he uses he uses a version of the spreadsheet that he's built to understand what the current performance is and what current performance is at different network settings and what the composition of the pages are. And beyond that, you'd have to talk to Tim. I know he does it, but yeah.
I know because Jonathan's promised to talk to the group on performance budget, so it's probably why he wants to know about that. Right, any more?
So you can't get around the geolocation because the test agent is obviously coming from an IP in a certain geo region. But where you come across things like the BBC where they're serving different content, and the test agent, so you're building the script in your Chrome browser in sunny London, and you want to run the test agent in Dublin, and there's a setting in here. If I go back here, called advanced. Save response bodies. So it'll actually save the bodies. It'll save the CSS and the JavaScript and the HTML and the images. So then if you've got a script that doesn't work, and you can go look at the content and see if you can find the selector you're targeting in the content.
I've suffered from this very problem, and the way that I've got around that is use your own private agents in the location that you actually want them to be. So the one big thing with AWS, it's the closest you can get to the UK is Ireland. It's not good enough
At the moment.
right? At the moment, yeah. So just build an agent for yourself. And again, this is where the relay thing may come in for me, that you can just have an agent sitting in the UK and a server in the UK and relay off to another one. It's really good. The other thing that we did on seatwave.com, because we're obviously testing our own site, we couldn't have this level of control over other people's sites that we were testing, but we introduced a query string into the a query string parameter into the URL, where we could force in an IP of a particular location, and the app itself would then say, "Oh, right, I am going to override the IP of where the test is coming from with that IP," and you get the site that you intended to get. So they're the techniques that I've worked around with that one. Any more before we go to
Go
Simon?
on, Simon.
Yeah, we'll go to Simon. Are we going to give an honourable mention to Request Map as well, in terms of what they were talking about third parties over there? It's quite an interesting little thing.
We'll talk about it later. So at the very beginning, you said there are 3 graphs you look at straight away when you run a test. Waterfall.
Yep.
The bandwidth.
Yep.
And CPU.
CPU.
Can you show me those in a mobile, please? Not a trick question.
And no, you don't get the same ones on a mobile, do you? You get so what you get on a mobile. It was a trick question because you knew the answer.
Priming you.
So I haven't got it here actually. So no, where is it? No, I don't have it. So when you test with, say you test with Chrome on a Moto G or an Android on the public instance, you'll see the timeline underneath. And strangely enough, iOS still emits some old Chrome-style timeline markers. So what you can do is actually, when WebPageTest does an iOS test on the public instance, you will see some Chrome timeline information. You can't import it into Chrome anymore, but you begin to see the charts of where the page is executing JavaScript, where it's painting. So you can begin to get some form of understanding, but you can't get it in the same level of detail. And the reason Simon wants that question answered is he's just submitted a talk on CPU usage of websites, and now he's got to write it.
I was really hoping you'd just write it for me right now. But you don't get the CPU and bandwidth graphs for mobile devices because you don't have that.
No, you get the timeline view.
Thank you.
You could, in theory, capture the bandwidth usage through the traffic shaping proxy, but it doesn't at the moment.
Any more questions?
No, they want food. Oh, one last question.
Last one.
I hear it's open source and you can find it on GitHub, and you would accept a pull request. I was kind of looking at it earlier, and I was thinking, do you have any plans for like the near future or doing something? I was personally looking at the UI.
So, Pat, by his own admission, would never claim to be a UI person, and the WebPageTest UI has evolved over time. Based on my conversations with him, he would love somebody to design a nice UI for it, but the thing to do is design it and have a conversation with Pat about it. And you know, he's one of the nicest people in our community, and he will quite happily have an open conversation with you about it and hint to you if you want to build new UI, about how you should go about doing it, how it can integrate.
Okay, right. Well, one last thank you to Andy for a great talk.